It's good to talk to you again. And I've been doing this other podcast, a movie podcast, and we just talked about Friday the 13th, but it was only two of the movies. And I know you've been doing this retrospective with Dana about Nightmare on Elm Street, but either you might have said in one of the episodes or maybe you tweeted out that you're kind of more of a Friday the 13th guy. Is that right?
That is correct. I am more of a Friday the 13th guy.
So maybe talk about that a little bit, because a part of the problem I have, and my co-host Adam, we're not really horror movie guys anyway, but even within the movies we like to watch, none of us really got hooked on the Friday the 13th series. So maybe just like tell me why you like them, why you prefer them to at least Freddy, and I don't know if you've seen all of them, but just kind of talk about what your experience has been with that franchise.
Sure. Part of it for me is that I guess kind of Friday got there first for me. I always really gravitated towards the hockey mask. I was a big hockey kid. I loved hockey growing up. And so I always sort of gravitated towards the hockey mask aesthetic of Jason. And I actually found the Nightmare on Elm Street movies when I was younger, because I started watching all of these when I was a kid. I found the Nightmare on Elm Street movies a little too scary, and I found the Friday the 13th movies a little more comfortable to watch and easier to watch, because they're not as scary as at least the best of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. They're not even close, realistically. And on top of that, I was the sweet, just target age for when my favorite Friday the 13th Part 6 came out. It came out in, I believe, 1986. And that was just, I was 10. It was the perfect age. It was the perfect movie because it's kind of a little bit of a horror comedy more than straight horror. And it's very witty and it's very clever, especially as far as Friday the 13th movies go. And so when that one came out, seeing that at 10, and on top of that, it has an absolutely killer Alice Cooper theme song. And I was a big Alice Cooper guy growing up. Still love Alice Cooper. And so that was just a perfect storm to make Friday much more my thing than Nightmare on Elm Street.
And how did you see that one? Was it at the theater?
No, I saw it on video. I mentioned this on Dana's show. My parents had some fairly flexible rules about what I could and couldn't watch. They typically had to watch it with me, and they would be willing to suffer through those movies for me because they were good parents. Love you, Mom and Dad. But they would not spend the money to go to the theater. And so, they would go, we went to the theater all the time, but those were movies that they would not spend. So I always had to wait till they came out on video, but then I could almost always get them, they'd rent them for me as soon as they came out on video. So I probably saw it the first or second week it came out on VHS.
Well, and I think I was probably kind of in the same boat. There were things I could rent that were R-rated that my parents certainly weren't going to take me to the theater to see. But at that age, 10, I don't remember watching too many horror movies unless it was maybe something on TV. We couldn't really rent them unless it was something kind of obscure. Maybe I could sort of sneak it in and watch it. But my parents knew enough, like Friday the 13th, they weren't going to let me rent that or watch that. So I never really bothered. But it just, I don't know, for whatever reason, just maybe because it was kind of a transgressive sort of movie. Like there were certain kids that watched those movies and they really seemed into the horror or at least that series. But for a lot of other kids, it was like, you maybe had to have lax parents or they had to be out of the house on a trip or whatever. Like it was kind of a big deal if you could get one of those home. But you watched the sixth one first, is that right?
No, I think I probably saw the fourth one first.
Is that the Corey Feldman one?
That's the Corey Feldman one. That's the final chapter that turns out not to even be close to the final chapter. And it's also the first in what's called, kind of considered loosely, the Tommy Jarvis trilogy of the series. The Friday the 13th series isn't really known for its continuity. It's got, worse continuity than most horror movies do. But there is a loose trilogy in the middle 4, 5, and 6, where they all feature the same main character, played by 3 different actors, mind you, but the same main character, Tommy Jarvis. And so I probably saw 4 first. I don't really have a ton of recollection of seeing 4 first. The most clear recollection I have is seeing 6 first, because when I saw 6, I was all in, and I don't know. Have you ever seen part 6, Colin?
I have not. I've heard it's possibly the best one. Would you agree with that?
There's certainly some disagreements amongst people as far as that goes, but a lot of people, myself included, do agree with that. I think it's the best one. It's certainly my favorite. A lot of people champion 4, and a lot of people champion 2. 2, 4, and 6 seem to kind of be the ones that most people claim as their favorite or as the best. And one of the reasons I asked is because, for those who don't know, and this isn't a spoiler, not that, I mean, seriously, spoilers for Friday the 13th, but, I was also a big James Bond guy, and the opening credits of Friday the 13th part 6 is Jason walking across the screen just like he's in a Bond intro, and instead of shooting the screen, he slashes it with a machete, and all this blood runs down and forms the title Jason Lives. And so, being a big Bond kid too, like, as soon as I saw that, I was all in on this movie. Like, you could not have hooked me anymore if you had tried.
Yeah, that's funny because I was a big James Bond fan growing up too, and I've never seen part 6. But I heard it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of black comedy. I mean, because the guy from Welcome Back, Kotter, Horshack, is the guy who revives Jason in the beginning, right?
Yeah, if I remember, I can't remember if it. I know Horshack's in it. I think he's the one that revives Jason or helps revive Jason.
Because what did he like? He sticks a metal spike in him to do a double tap.
Yeah, he and Tommy Jarvis, the main character played by Tom Matthews in this one, are Tommy's convinced that Jason's not really dead, and so they go dig up Jason. And this, again, all happens at the very start of the movie. And Jason, sure enough, is dead, and Tommy actually freaks out and starts stabbing him with like a wrought iron fence post. And then it gets struck by lightning, and that's what brings Jason back to life. And that's where, contrary to popular belief, it's not until part 6 that we actually get the sort of zombie, unkillable Jason that people think that he is. In the earlier ones, they push the bounds of believability, but he is very much a mortal man. It's not until 6 that he becomes zombie Jason, and then we get zombie Jason for the rest of the series.
Well, that's interesting to know because, again, I think the only ones I've seen all the way through is 1 and 2, and Jason as the killer does not factor into the first movie at all, really. He kind of pops in at the end, but it's the second one. He has the bag over his head, the sack or whatever it is. And then it's not really till part 3 that you get the hockey mask.
That is correct. Yeah.
So kind of, my perception always been, years ago, is that he was the killer. He had the hockey mask in all those movies, but that's not till the third one, which was in 3D, which is another kind of weird twist on the franchise. But then you say in part 6, he kind of is this unstoppable, super killer, essentially.
Correct. Yeah. From part 6 on, he is a monster, like an actual monster. He ends up, they increase his strength level. They make it so that he can't actually be killed. He ends up, you sort of have to contain him instead of actually killing him. And so that is really what's so funny about the Friday the 13th series is when you compare it to, say, Halloween, which is actually my favorite horror franchise. Well, I shouldn't even say that. Halloween is by far and away my favorite of these types of movies. It's, I think Halloween's a masterpiece. I do like some of the Friday the 13th movies more than the other Halloween sequels, but the first Halloween's always going to stand, king of the mountain for me. But Michael Myers in that movie is more or less fully formed, right? Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger is more or less fully formed. he becomes a lot jokier and a lot wittier and stuff like that, but he still has, in the very first Nightmare on Elm Street, he's still got the fedora, the razor gloves, the burned face, the striped sweater, all of that sort of stuff. The look is still already there. Jason was really a work in progress over several movies. I mean, like you said, he doesn't even get the hockey mask. The most iconic thing about him, he doesn't even get until the third movie. So it's a really interesting franchise in that we have this very clear conception of who Jason Voorhees is, but certainly the filmmakers didn't, because it took them forever to figure out who he actually is or what he actually is. And I would argue that it's not until 6 that we actually get the Jason that when we think of Jason, that's the Jason that we're thinking of.
Yeah. So have you seen all of them?
Sure have.
Okay. And have you seen, I'm guessing you've seen some more than others, like some, like maybe 6. Have you seen it a bunch of times?
Yeah, I've definitely not seen all of them multiple times. And some of them I frankly haven't revisited in years. If you want to ask me pointed questions about Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, that's part 9. I'm not going to have a lot of answers for you because I don't particularly like that movie and I haven't watched it in probably 20 years. So, my knowledge of that one's going to come from reading the book Crystal Lake Memories and watching the documentary, the companion documentary, because I haven't watched that movie in forever.
Crystal Lake Memories.
Crystal Lake Memories. It's a big coffee table book written by Peter Bracke, who used to run the High Def Digest website. It is one of the most thorough, thoughtful, just full tellings of the making of a franchise that I've ever read in my life. Whether you like Friday the 13th or not, if you like movies and you like independent movies and stuff like that and retrospectives on how they were made, I think any film fan has to own or should own Crystal Lake Memories. It's a tremendous book. And it will, I think, give most people a greater appreciation of Friday the 13th as a series. Because, there was never a point where these movies weren't underdogs. No matter how successful they were always underdogs because they were always sort of the redheaded stepchild of Paramount. Paramount didn't like that Friday the 13th made them all this money. And so they kept giving them these ridiculously low budgets and not bringing in real high talent. I mean, I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but if you compare the directors of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, where you got Wes Craven and even Jack Shoulder, but then Chuck Russell and Rennie Harlan and Stephen Hopkins. Like, you've got some very heavy hitters. Danny Steinman, who directed part 5, ain't in that same class. And so you really get to appreciate how hard everybody worked on these movies because they had to. They were always playing kind of with one hand tied behind their backs trying to make all these movies.
Well, and I think the first one, it only cost like $500,000. So it was, it was a big hit, obviously. But that's interesting to hear that Paramount didn't really give the franchise any respect. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Paramount liked the money, but they hated and they hated the controversy that it caused. Friday the 13th became such a flashpoint for that sort of early to mid 80s Tipper Gore anti-Hollywood sort of push.
Right.
Siskel and Ebert have their very famous hatred of this series. And I think Paramount felt, I can't speak for a mega conglomerate, but they were clearly embarrassed by it. This was not the thing that they wanted. This was the home of Star Trek, thoughtful science fiction. And which, of course, if you ask a Trekker, they'll tell you that Paramount shit on Star Trek just as much as they, Paramount wanted to be respectable. They didn't like that genre movies were what kept them afloat. Of course, once they stopped making genre movies, now Paramount is barely even a studio. So take what you will from that.
Well, and they had Indiana Jones too, another huge franchise. But that's interesting because usually studios, it's kind of like if you're if you're making a profit, it seems like they shouldn't care. But still, they had this sort of looking down their nose at the Friday the 13th series just because it was kind of trashy.
Yeah, absolutely. And and again, the 80s were weird as far as that stuff goes, because we were this weird era of kind of anything goes, like how you have the cocaine decade and Tipper Gore's Parents Music Resource Center rise in the same decade just absolutely, blows my mind. It tells you that there was a lot of weird stuff going on in this country in the 80s as far as who it's not that different from, well, at least how things were, 4 years ago, of there's a lot of hypocrisy as far as who we present to be versus who we actually are. And so it was very convenient for a lot of people to find scapegoats like Friday the 13th or Judas Priest in music or, whatever it may be. I mean, this is also the decade that had the whole satanic child abuse fiascos going on. And so there's just all this storm coming together. And unfortunately, because Friday the 13th was a big pop culture phenomenon, it became a very easy target, and I think that made Paramount nervous. And so at least if nothing else, Paramount was always able to say, hey, look, this is just this little movie series that we make. It's not really who we are. Just leave us alone about it, Again, I can't speak for a mega corporation, but that certainly was my take on it as much as I remember at the time. It's my take on it after reading Crystal Lake Memories, and I haven't seen anything to convince me I'm wrong.
Well, it's interesting because around the time, again, like when I was a kid, I sort of thought that, Jason was the first one, but it's really Halloween that sort of sets this genre up, the slasher genre, the sort of supernatural, whatever you want to call it. And there's so many ripoffs of all these movies kind of happening. But I guess because, Friday the 13th is Paramount, that you think that's kind of why it survives? I mean, obviously the first one makes money, but do you think just because they have that big distribution that's really why these movies succeed? Because I mean, all these other, there's too many to name, but like, why do you kind of think these movies really find an audience? What's kind of going on there?
Well, I think the first one was successful because the director, Sean, and the producer, Sean Cunningham, knew what he was doing. He knew how to market things. He knew how to create buzz. I mean, he's the producer of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, another very infamous horror movie from the 70s. And Cunningham knew what he was doing. And I think one of the biggest things he did was hang a very memorable title. As much as he will fully admits, he was just making a ripoff of Halloween, and they came up with the title because it was another holiday that they could hang it on. But Friday the 13th is such a unique holiday. It's so much better than, Valentine's Day or Easter or something as far as being a memorable thing. And it's not really a holiday. So you can release it on a Friday the 13th, which they did several times. And people aren't going to have family obligations, but who doesn't want to go see Friday the 13th on Friday the 13th? Like, that's just what you would do. And so
Right.
I think there's a lot of really clever marketing. And then as stuff like that started to wane, they were smart enough to change things up. Like you mentioned, Jason's not even in the first one until the very end. But then we get Jason in the second one, and he's sackhead Jason. But then they change him up again, and we get, and just as maybe some of this stuff was starting to wane, we get the hockey mask. And now all of a sudden you have built-in posters, right? You have everything you need because you have an iconic image to go with the iconic name of your franchise. And boom, you're done. And that coincided with the rise of people actually starting to like the killers in these movies more than they like the people who were supposed to be rooting for. And they'd built an icon. So from then on out, it was done until, like all good things, that slasher craze just naturally kind of came to an end at the end of the 80s.
Well, I guess sort of all these guys, they sort of need their hook. Like, Freddy has the razor hands, and Michael Myers has the mask, and then Jason has the hockey mask by the third one. And that sort of just becomes that iconic symbol for him. And just kind of seeing a hockey mask on the ground is kind of freaking out. Like,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you compare it to some of the other killers of the era, like Harry Warden from My Bloody Valentine or Cropsey from The Burning. They look cool, but there's nothing really iconic about them. There was just something about that hockey mask that made it look so instantly classic, instantly memorable. And I think that's certainly for me, that has always been one of the driving forces for me. I mean, I still get excited when I see, that hockey mask and stuff like that. Like it's like a warm blanket for me.
Were you a dark kid growing up?
Not really, to tell you the truth. I actually was a bit of a sensitive lad. So it's funny because I watched all these horror movies, but then I also slept with a nightlight on until I was 10.
Because of Friday the 13th?
Just because of everything. I had a really overactive imagination. And so I loved being scared and I loved watching them. But then when it came time to go to bed, I wouldn't be able to shut my brain off. And that would be a little bit of a catch-22. But yeah.
Well, I guess we all sort of have a movie that maybe traumatized us when we were 10 or 11. Dana says it's Nightmare on Elm Street. And for me, it was The Exorcist. But I wonder in terms of scariness with these Friday the 13th movies, how scary do you actually find them?
I don't find them very scary at all. And to be honest with you, this was never, I think that's maybe one of the reasons I liked this series so much.
Yeah.
This was never a series that I particularly found that scary or that traumatic. It was more just, I thought, a lot of fun to watch this killer, go through and do his thing and see these really cool kills, and occasionally you'd get some memorable heroes and stuff. So I don't find this series scary, and that's not why I gravitate towards it. I think it's a fun series of popcorn movies that are great for date night or, midnight movies. Obviously I wasn't doing this when I was a kid, but drinking some beers or some whiskey and just kicking back and kind of watching a silly horror movie. I don't find them scary at all, and to be truthful.
Well, and I think by part 6, as you just said, it was starting to get a little campy. And some of the later movies, I haven't seen all the movies, and I've seen a few of the later ones, but Jason Goes to Manhattan, Jason Goes to Space, Jason Fights Freddy. So it's kind of turning into a self-parody in a way. And they're still gory, but they're not really scary anymore.
No. And I think that's a thing that just inevitably happens to any long-running franchise, especially in the horror genre. I mean, how many times has Halloween been rebooted? Nightmare on Elm Street became, frankly, an even bigger self-parody than Friday the 13th ever did, because Friday the 13th wasn't that serious to start with. But if you look at the drop from the first Nightmare on Elm Street to, say, Nightmare on Elm Street 5 or Freddy's Dead, man, you're going from one of the greatest horror movies ever made to not, I guess, to be kind. I mean, Friday had an advantage because it never started that high. It was never anything other than, and I mean this with the most love, it was never anything other than a garbage series. It was never going to be better than a garbage series. And I think that helped it because it was already kind of campy when it started. So it didn't have that far to go into more ridiculous camp. And that's why there's no real Friday movie that I hate. I don't particularly like Jason Goes to Hell. I don't particularly like Jason Takes Manhattan. But if I had to sit down and watch them, I would certainly watch them 10 times over my least favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie or my least favorite Halloween movie.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and Halloween started with, a pretty much a 4 out of 4 star movie, the first one, and Nightmare on Elm Street started pretty well too. But yeah, the Friday the 13th series, it's not the first one isn't great. I mean, it's fairly effective, but then the second one is not good. And kind of, I know, I guess some people they've seen a few here and there. That's kind of where I'm at. I guess you've seen all of them, but it's interesting how it kind of goes full circle. It kind of starts as this semi-serious horror movie, but then becomes kind of a self-parody. But I haven't seen, there was a reboot. I'm not sure when they remade the first movie. You've seen that one too, right?
Well, so they didn't really remake the first one. What they did is remake the first 3, essentially. Right. And they condensed them down. So yeah, it came out in 2009. It's from Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes, directed by Marcus Nispel, who did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. And what you basically get is the movie opens with the ending, a remake of the ending of the first movie. And then you get about 20 minutes that's basically a remake of the second movie. And then the rest of the movie is a, part 3, part 4 sort of remake to take you through to the end of the movie. So they jam a lot into it. I know a lot of people don't like the 2009 remake. I'm actually a pretty big fan of it. I would put it in my upper tier of Friday the 13th movies, because I think I view it as, if I was going to show somebody who'd never seen a Friday the 13th movie before, what one am I going to pick for them? And I got to be honest, the remake is probably the easiest one to show somebody. And because if they're not vibing on the remake, they're not going to be vibing on any of the rest of the series. So you might as well just save your time. But if they dig the remake, then you can be like, okay, well, now let's go back and watch the older ones, and you can see, the antecedents of what this movie is and why it does the things it does.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you don't really have much interest in this series, you're not going to want to sit through 2.5 movies just to get to the hockey mask. But it sounds like this reboot, they kind of put all of those first 4 movies into one. So you've got to the hockey mask, and then they kill him at the end, I guess, and set up another one. Has there been another one since then?
No, because, and I am far from an expert on all of this aspect, but the rights to the Friday the 13th series are absolutely jacked. The screenwriter, Victor Miller of the original, has sued Sean Cunningham and Platinum Dunes and basically everybody that's got their hands on Friday the 13th, claiming that because he wrote the first movie, everything comes from him, and so he therefore has the rights to it. But the problem is the counter argument is that, well, he didn't actually really invent Jason. Like, yes, he invented the child Jason Voorhees that drowns in the lake that sets all of this off, but Jason as we know it, he had nothing to do with. And there's just been lots of lawsuits back and forth and back and forth. I mean, it's part of the reason when the series went to New Line, they had to start calling them Jason movies rather than Friday. So it's Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, and Freddy versus Jason, because New Line they didn't have the rights to the name Friday the 13th. They had the rights to Jason Voorhees. And so for the last 10 years, 11 years, it's just been an utter chaotic mess, and nobody really knows how it's going to play out. So no, there has not been a new Friday the 13th since 2009. It's the longest since the series started that there's never been one. And it doesn't look like we're going to get one again anytime soon, because the longer this goes on, I feel like the less people are going to care.
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, I think the first movie, the first Friday the 13th, they had to sort of do some legal finagling to get the name, because there was another movie called Friday the 13th in maybe like the 60s or something. Do you know about that?
I vaguely remember it, but I don't know. I don't remember any of the details.
Okay. It might have been like Friday the 13th was in the title. I don't think it was just Friday the 13th, but it might have been had a subtitle, or that was the subtitle. But I'm not sure exactly what they did to kind of get the rights to it, but after a while, I think, by the time I was watching those movies as a kid, people just called them the Jason movies anyway. No one called them Friday the 13th anymore.
Yeah, and that goes along with kind of that change in the mid 80s where the movies were more about the slasher than they were about the other characters, right? The team up movie isn't called A Nightmare on Elm Street meets Friday the 13th. It's Freddy versus Jason.
Right.
Because that's what matters is it's Freddy versus Jason. That's why you're watching that movie, is to watch them beat the crap out of each other. So
Yeah, but it's interesting to see that, the evolution of this character, because he gets the hockey mask in the third movie, and I'm not sure if it's the third movie or the fourth one. Like, he's literally like the Man in Black at that point. He's got like a black windbreaker or whatever, like black pants, black shoes. So it's like he's got the hockey mask, but the rest of him is just like totally black. Like, if you didn't get it at that point, like, he is a bad guy.
Yep, exactly.
Look at his outfit, stomping around the woods. So, like you mentioned Siskel and Ebert, and they kind of hated these movies because I think they just saw them as nihilistic. It wasn't necessarily the violence, because I know Ebert liked Halloween, but didn't like the Friday the 13th. Obviously, there's difference between just the direction and the acting, just at least how the first movie's made. Halloween's definitely the superior movie, but the violence kind of bothered them because there's no real, morality or anything to these movies. Did the violence ever bother you watching these? I guess not, huh? But
not in these, not ever in these, because I think they're so over the top and ridiculous that it never really. There are violent movies that bother me, but these just never got to me. These always felt more to me like Looney Tunes cartoons. Just these insanely ridiculous things. Jason's basically, it's kind of the reverse of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, right? Like, Jason's basically because the Roadrunner always gets away and Wile E. Coyote always gets hurt. And in these movies, the victims always try and get away and they never can, and they can't stop Jason, and he always catches them no matter how much, the famous joke of they're running and running and running and running, and he's just walking at a brisk pace, and somehow he still always manages to be right behind them. So to me, they just always seemed like Looney Tunes cartoons. They just never were. I understand what Siskel and Ebert, and I know every 6 months, on horror Twitter, that whole thing gets relitigated about them saying it. I don't want to relitigate it. What I do think is that I think their vitriol could have probably been directed at other movies that were made in the genre, in the era, than the Friday the 13th movie. They complain they're nihilistic, they complain they're misogynistic, they complain, they're immoral and unconscionable. And I assure you, there are plenty of slasher movies that came out in the 80s that tick all of those boxes. For me, I don't really think the Friday the 13th ones do. I think some of them are better or worse than others as far as some of that stuff goes. But on the whole, I just don't think they tick those boxes as much.
Yeah, and kind of rewatching some reviews they did of the earlier movies, it seems a little over the top now. Because, like you said, they kind of became sort of cartoonish, and maybe that was a way to sort of save the series to a certain degree. Because if it's just Jason working the slaughterhouse in every movie, like, it's going to get repetitive, and it's eventually going to turn people off, if only just because they're going to get bored with it. So, yeah, maybe part 6 and them kind of it being more of a comedy, so to speak, that it kind of injected some new life into the series. What do you think of that?
It did, but only for a few years, because regardless of what this series did, the entire 80s slasher movement was just doing the lambs to the slaughter thing. And by the end of the 80s, people were burned out on them, and the movies got, in a lot of ways, they got worse and worse. I think you can kind of argue that certainly for the big franchises, the late 80s, early 90s are sort of the nadir of their quality. And then they take some time off and they come back, and they typically come back and bounce back better. Freddy's Dead, a lot of people would argue, is the worst Nightmare on Elm Street. Takes a few years off, bounces back with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is, pretty terrific.
Yeah.
Like I said, Jason Goes to Hell is, I think, probably the worst Friday the 13th movie. Takes some time off, bounces back with Jason X, which I actually think is a blast, even though it's easy to mock Jason Goes to Space. But if you haven't actually seen the movie, it is just an absolute blast. And it also, again, has that very Friday the 13th Part 6, knowing, winking, clever tone to it that a lot of the other movies don't have. And so they kind of have to lay dormant for a while. I mean, it's like anything. You drive anything into the ground, people are going to get sick of it, right? No, I mean, we're literally sick of Star Wars. Whoever thought in our entire lives that could possibly happen? But people are sick of Star Wars. Like,
I am.
It can happen to anything if you overdo it. And they certainly overdid these types of movies in the end of the 80s.
Yeah, well, now that you mentioned Jason Goes to Hell, I think I did see that one. I might have seen that one at the theater, but it was pretty forgettable. But it's interesting. I think you said on Dana's show, you kind of framed the 80s as really the slasher movie decade in a lot of ways, because even something like Terminator is really essentially it's a Jason movie to a certain degree. It's like Jason sci-fi in LA. I mean, it's sort of the same character to a degree, right?
Yeah, no, the Terminator, at least in the first 1984 Terminator, he's absolutely a slasher. He is Jason. And the other series that we did, I repeatedly talked about how John Rambo is basically the slasher as the hero. Because when in all the Rambo movies, when he sort of goes on his rampages in the third act of the movie, he's framed and shot like a slasher. You've got all your soldiers, be they Vietnamese or Russian or whoever, and they're looking around for him, and he's stalking around behind them and slitting their throats with his Rambo, his killer, just awesome big Rambo knives. I mean, it really is a slasher decade, because slashers had permeated so many movies that weren't even slashers. And you also got some that were these weird combinations. Chuck Norris had one called Silent Rage that is a combination slasher movie, Chuck Norris movie, where the killer is this guy who ends up getting genetically enhanced so he can't be killed. And 85% of the movie is a straight up slasher movie. It's him stalking around, killing people. And then the last 15 minutes is, Chuck Norris kicking him in the face like it's a Chuck Norris movie. There was just so many weird things going on with slashers in the 80s. So many of which have been kind of forgotten because, again, they don't have the hockey mask.
Well, I guess in kind of all these franchises, they have to kind of top themselves with each one, right? I mean, even something like Rocky, like the first movie, it's kind of this somewhat slowly paced drama, and it's about people. But then, like by part 4, it's just like montages, and the fights are just ridiculously violent. And you got Drago as like a Bond character. It's like, it seems like every series they sort of go down this path. And I mean, like you said with Rambo, I mean, that's a pretty good example. Although, as you talked about on Dana's show, like the first book is actually way worse than the movie is. But
yeah, he's truly a slasher in the first book. Like he's truly a very nasty human being in the first book.
Yeah, that was very interesting to hear. Did they do like novelizations of the Friday the 13th movies?
They sure did, at least a few of them. I had, and I don't have it anymore, much to my chagrin. They did a great novelization for Part 6, Jason Lives, that really was interesting because it was like a lot of novelizations. It put in a bunch of additional backstory and stuff like that was just really interesting to read. I actually think the novelization of Part 6 is, it's been years since I've read it. And like I said, I don't have my novelization anymore. But it's really terrific. And it has some stuff that kind of over the years has become sort of canon to the Friday the 13th mythos, if you will. So they did do novelizations for several of the movies.
That's interesting because, I guess, and I think you talked about this before, but they sort of stopped doing that by the time everyone had a VCR because people could just rewatch the movie. They didn't need to read the book version of the movie. Is that what happened?
Yeah, pretty much. They carried over into sort of more or less the first half of the 90s, because even in the first half of the 90s, buying your own videos was still sometimes kind of prohibitively expensive. It wasn't until, I remember it was about 94, 95 when everything, starting in 86 with Top Gun, the big releases came out at a sell-through purchase price, $24.95 or whatever. But things that weren't that were still like $95 to buy on VHS. And it was kind of around 92, 93 that I feel like when Suncoast, you remember Suncoast, Colin? You remember going to Suncoast in the mall?
We didn't, not in the town where I grew up. There were mom and pop, but when I got older, you would still see those around.
And their primary thing was sell-through. And so that sort of drove down a little bit the price. And I think that started kind of the end of the novelization, although some still pop up every once in a while. I bought one a few years ago for Pacific Rim because I thought there was some additional stuff in there that wasn't in the movies that I wanted to check out. But for the most part, as an industry, mid 90s, they were done because that is the reason. There was no reason why you would buy a book of a movie when you could just buy the movie.
Yeah, it's funny because I grew up in a small town, but I think the grocery store we had, they'd be like right by the checkout. Usually there was like a rack and they'd have like some trashy VC Andrews, like those haunted house books or whatever they were. And then there'd be like the novelization of Predator or whatever. I don't think I ever bought one, but every now and then I would just kind of thumb through one to see what it was. I remember reading through one of Dirty Harry somewhere. I'm sure there's some people that collect those. I kind of would like to see one. I'm sure you can get them on eBay or Amazon or wherever, but I haven't looked at one of those. Do they still sell those at Barnes and Noble?
If there's one that comes out, you can usually find them. If you go, Barnes and Noble has a big movie section, and you can oftentimes find them there. Sometimes they'll be in the genre section. Amazon's a good place to find them. Like you said, if you want to find old ones, eBay, you can usually score a lot of them dirt cheap. There are people that collect them. I follow some people on Twitter who collect them because, again, I think they are, the most interesting thing about novelizations, and I mentioned this on Dana's show, is because in order for the books to be written, edited, published, and released at the same time as the movie, the authors very often have to work from early scripts. And anybody that knows how movies are made knows, scripts are getting changed all the way up until basically they're done filming. I mean, scripts are often rewritten on set on the scene.
Right.
And so sometimes you can get just some wild differences between what these novelizations are and what the actual final movie looks like.
Well, and you really did your homework on that Rambo series. I mean, man, you read the first 3 books at least, right?
Well, there's only 3. I read the first one, which is David Morrell's original book. And then I read his novelizations of Rambo 2 and Rambo 3. And I really think his novelizations of Rambo 2 and 3 are vastly superior to the movies. I think they're really terrific.
Yeah. It was really his baby. I mean, he was very protective of that character. I mean, you had said that he kind of worked it in that I mean, he had to basically have approval of any use of the character, right? I mean, they couldn't make a movie unless he said so. Is that true?
No. So the interesting thing is they could make all the movies they wanted. When he sold the rights, he sold the rights to the movies, but he
Okay.
kept the rights to any book. So if
Oh,
they
okay.
wanted to write, if they wanted to do a novelization, he had right of first refusal on doing the novelization. And there's a lot in those novelizations because, again, for people who don't know, we can't really dance around it. Rambo dies in the book, in the first book. And so he had some real emotional conflict over, how do I bring this character back who died in my book? And he ended up just literally writing one sentence that said, in my novel First Blood, Rambo dies, in the movie he lives, and then just goes from there, and that's it.
Yeah, you got to do what you got to do. I always kind of wonder about these guys who were given the task of writing the novelization of a movie, like what that was like for them, how long it took, how much did they get paid? Was it just like excruciating, or is it kind of fun? Like, I don't know. I've never met anyone who's been that kind of a writer. I think about it a lot with children's books. I'll read my kids' book, part of a series, so like there's really no author. It's just a frozen story, you know? And I wonder how the author feels about this kind of work.
Yeah, or you get those series, those long-running series, like, I don't even know if they're still around, but, the Hardy Boys, where,
Right.
like, the author, the original creator, had been not involved or dead even, and it was just this endless parade of sort of factory writers that would just churn these things out so they could come out like clockwork once a month or once every 2 months.
Yeah.
And the thing with the novelization is there definitely was an art to it, because if you go back and look at just a stack of movie novelizations, what you'll find is the same names popping up over and over and over again, because I think there really was an art to doing novelizations, and the good ones could work quick, and therefore they could work more, which meant they probably, I would imagine, probably made a pretty good living at it. There was one, I don't remember who it was. I don't remember the name. It was one of the more well-known ones, who also wrote his own stuff under, he had a pseudonym for the novelizations and then wrote his own stuff, and basically said that, he could turn around a novelization in a couple of weeks and would get paid enough for a few of those that would support him writing his own novels the rest of the year.
Right.
But it only worked because he was so fast at turning them around.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, how even if it's not something your heart is really in, to write an entire book in a couple of weeks is pretty astounding. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that there are these. I mean, that in itself is kind of like a Hollywood movie of a guy like writing novelizations for his meal ticket and then doing the artsy novel or the personal novel on the side. That doesn't surprise me.
Well, especially because the other thing to remember is half the work is kind of already done for you, because one of the hardest
True.
parts of writing is creating the story. You're given a script that's already done. And so all you've got to do is flesh out the dialogue, flesh out some characters, stuff like that. But you don't actually have to really create anything out of whole cloth, which
that's true.
I think makes it a lot easier to turn that stuff around.
Okay, well, I got a couple more questions for you. You said that the violence never bothered you. Have you ever been bothered by the depiction of women in these movies or horror movies generally? Has that ever bothered you?
Oh, of course it has. I find it more upsetting when I see it in modern movies, just because, and maybe this is a dumb way of looking at it, but I feel like we should know better now. We should have known better back then too, but we should definitely know better now. And so when I see, for instance, things like rape scenes in movies and stuff that we just shouldn't be doing anymore, it really bothers me. A lot of horror movies, the whole rape revenge genre is a thing that exists, that is, barring a handful of exceptions, a genre that I just generally don't enjoy or like or think is done particularly well. The thing is I actually don't think those movies last all that well. I, again, kind of think Friday the 13th gets a bit of a bum rap for that.
I think this is an interesting thing to think about because, I know what you're talking about. And when the original Friday the 13th came out, you had a couple movies that came out that year that were really infamous. One of them being Caligula, another being I Spit on Your Grave, which I've never seen. I've read reviews of it. I know they remade I Spit on Your Grave. I'm sure they're probably going to remake Caligula at some point. But Caligula was a straight up X-rated movie. I mean, it was pornographic, it was violent, kind of had everything. Not a critical darling, but I Spit on Your Grave is what you're talking about. It was a revenge fantasy where there's a sexual assault and then the woman comes back and kills all these guys. It's amazing that has kind of persisted in certain films, not really so much the Friday the 13th movies, but there's obviously a lot of violence against women in it. But at the same time, and the Friday the 13th movies aren't really serious movies, but the women are also the heroes in the first couple movies too. And you see that play out in a lot of other horror movies. So, I mean, have you thought kind of like, well, they sort of balance it? I mean, they do have heroic women, certainly in better movies like in Aliens, that franchise. Sigourney Weaver's a really strong character. But do you see that in other horror movies too, with the strong female characters?
Yes and no. I think a lot of other horror movies try to, it's the whole final girl model, right? The idea that kind of really started with Jamie Lee Curtis. She's the final survivor and right. All of that. I actually think the Friday series does a quite a better job at it than most. Again, I will fully admit I am a straight white cis male. I am probably not the right person to even be going down this path because my voice is the last one that anyone needs to hear on this. What I think there's a lot of problems with misogyny in horror. I think there's a lot of horror movies that have those problems. I think the Friday the 13th series gets a bum rap for it. I don't think they're nearly as bad as a lot of people say they are. I don't think they're very bad at all as far as that goes. Jason's not a rapist. Jason's just a killer. He just is he's a force of nature is what he is. But right. The solution to that, and this is one thing that we are seeing, I think, more of, is horror just needs more diverse voices. The biggest problem with all of these movies is they're all written by white men. And so there's nobody that says, hey, do we really need to see her boobs here? Like, is that like, I get it if we got to market the movie, but do we really need to do it? And so more diverse voices in horror would help solve a lot of those problems, which of course some studios and some places are really trying to focus on, others not so much.
And I think, probably the best horror movie in the last 10 years, I would venture is probably Get Out. Would you agree?
I would say it's up there. I've got others that I think I like a little bit more, but I would say that it's up there.
But at least in terms of like diversity, like what you're talking about, I mean
it's terrific. It's a great movie. Yeah.
Yeah. But no, and it's funny too, because when you watch the first couple movies, Friday the 13th, there is sort of this formula of you set up the kids at the camp and they have sex and then they get killed in this horrible way. And you do have women taking their clothes off, not, all that much necessarily in the first couple movies. But it seems like by the later movies, that all kind of goes away. I mean, for one, Jason's not even he's not even at the camp after a while. He's in space. He's in New York. He's like not even there. So you don't really have like this teenager, the babe factor isn't, there after a while. So I feel like maybe like teenagers are kind of seeing these movies for the sex as much as the violence initially, but then it just kind of seems like the violence takes over. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think the thing is at least sticking to Friday, there's never as much sex in these movies as people think they are. If you go back and watch them, most of them at least, I will argue that Friday the 13th Part 5 is, I like that movie. I know a lot of my friends like that movie, but when I say that it is quite a bit skeezier than any of the other Friday movies, I don't think they would disagree with me on that one. But most of the other ones, there's a whole lot less sex. There's a whole lot less nudity. I'm not saying there isn't any, but there's a whole lot less than people think there are. It's kind of,
Yeah.
it's almost a little bit with some of this stuff with Friday, it's almost a little bit of a Mandela effect of how
Right.
we've got it in our brains that, like in these movies, if you have sex, you die. Well, kind of, but there's also a lot of people who die that don't have sex. Like, it's not like not having sex is going to save you from Jason.
Right.
And some of these other tropes that have become so ingrained in us aren't really there, at least in the early movies. Now, like a lot of long running series, sometimes it started believing its own tropes, but for the most part, like, these are surprisingly tame movies, at least by 2020 standards, for the things that they get accused of.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see kind of it being a creature of their time, because when you're watching these movies, we kind of came in around the VCR period, but if you were going to the movies to see these back in the day, like, you can't see this on TV. You can't see it on a video yet. There's certainly no internet. So, like, if you wanted a movie with some R-rated stuff, like, you had to go to the theater, and Friday the 13th kind of gave you your money's worth, for lack of a better word. Like, you get to see some good-looking women, and you get to see the violence, and you get your scares, and you kind of go home. Now people don't need to go to the movies to see that. So it's kind of like, it's amazing to watch horror. I mean, I don't see a lot of horror movies, but, like, there's no sex, no nudity, like nothing really anymore. At least the ones that I've seen. And I guess because they don't feel like they have to. But in Friday the 13th's defense, I mean, maybe if Hitchcock had been directing in 1980, 81, maybe Janet Leigh would have been naked in the shower, like, who knows? I mean, there are limitations in the 60s to what they could show.
And given Hitchcock's notorious attitudes towards women,
Right.
I don't think that there's any question that if he had been directing later, he would have, we would have seen Janet Leigh naked in the shower, or we would have seen, Kim Novak naked, or whatever, like. Right. And, you brought up an interesting point, and it's a really quick point I just wanted to make, but that's one other thing that people forget about these movies when they criticize them for being so formulaic. Remember, when you were seeing this in the theater, like, you saw it, and then you had to wait a whole year to see, you didn't get to just binge all, 11 of them at
Right.
once. Like, that's not how it worked. So of course they were formulaic, because people would forget in the year or two that it took for the new movie to come out. They only seem formulaic. I mean, they are, but they only seem really formulaic because we've all watched them so many times on video and DVD and stuff like that. Now, when we watch them, I know when I watch them, even if I don't watch the whole series, I watch at least 3 or 4 in a matter of a day or two. That's how I watch them now. And so they do seem more formulaic because of that, but that wasn't the case in 1981.
Right. Well, and it's pretty amazing. You look at when they come out. I think the second one came out less than a year. I mean, it was like 10 or 11 months after the first movie, they already had a second one. And the thing too that people, I'm going to sound like grandpa here, but, like, back in the day, like, a movie might be running for 6 months, maybe even a year. You weren't seeing it a year after it came out. It might only been like 6 or 8 months after you saw the first one. I mean, so they could really kind of close the gap with people getting to see the next one. Friday the 13th was maybe an exception, because it's almost, like you said, part 6 is 86, where it's like every year they're coming out with a new Friday the 13th. So it's like 5 was in 85 and 4 was in 84. So they were really churning them out. Not so much with Halloween. I guess Freddy, they were doing about once every year or 2 years.
Yeah, they were doing Nightmare pretty much every year. They ran those. Yeah. Halloween actually is interesting because arguably Friday the 13th saved the Halloween franchise, because after Halloween 3, it was pretty well dormant And then they brought it back to try and capitalize on Jason and Freddy and some of the other slashers, with Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Like, and that was, I mean, I remember a lot of the marketing was kind of the idea of like the original is back sort of thing. And so it's kind of interesting how the one that started all of this ended up playing catch up. Now, that being said, it's still, the 2018 Halloween did astronomically huge box office. So obviously, I think there's still a lot more favorable attitudes about Halloween than there is about Friday the 13th. I don't think anybody really, I don't think a new Friday the 13th would have necessarily done the business that Halloween did. Although in fairness, the remake and Freddy vs. Jason did monster box office numbers as well. So we like our slashers that are, once they hit the cultural lexicon, we like our slashers and we will continue to go see them.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say Friday the 13th kind of saved Halloween, because you can see that in the second one is certainly, I think it came out in 1981. It's certainly kind of a response to Friday the 13th and some, all of the slasher movies that had been released since Halloween. But I don't know, maybe someone like Rob Zombie will do for Friday the 13th what he did for Halloween. Because I mean, I wouldn't really say any of the Friday the 13th movies are quote unquote good movies, but I feel like somebody could do a pretty damn good remake or something with this series and take it in kind of a new direction if anybody cares about that. I think they do. I mean, you'd see another Friday the 13th, right?
Oh, hell yeah, man. I mean, assuming we could actually go to movie theaters again, I'd be there opening night. I especially if it had talent, especially if there was actual somebody like his movies or dislike his movies. And I dislike far more of his movies than I like, but I think Rob Zombie's a pretty talented director. I think he's a mediocre writer, and that's where he ends up getting shot in the foot. But if you had an actual honest to God director, take somebody like Lee Whannell, who did Upgrade and this year's Invisible Man, or James Wan, who did Saw, he's well beyond that. He's making Aquaman now. But if you had somebody like them who had actual honest to good talent and a vision and writing ability, I think there's a lot you could do with Friday the 13th. I think the remake almost got there, but it fell a little short. But I really think there's a lot you could do here because, again, you've already got an iconic character. And the best part of Jason, as far as that goes, is he's a blank slate. You can kind of do whatever you want with him because he's not. Freddy has a character already dialed in. The Scream movies, even though there's a different killer in every Scream movie, there's kind of a formula for those movies that's already dialed in. There's really not with Friday the 13th. I mean, the fact that of all these slasher characters, the only one that's gone to space is Jason kind of tells you that he's the blank slate that you can drop into whatever genre or formula or format that you want to do and have some fun with it.
Well, and I feel, if you did want to kind of give the Scream treatment or maybe do something, kind of meta, kind of postmodern in the fact that the original movie is 40 years old. So the actors who are in that movie are probably in their 60s now. And there might be kids who are in their teens or even early 20s who have never seen any of these movies, don't know anything about it. And if you kind of maybe played around with that idea, they're back at the summer camp. Everyone knows about Friday the 13th, except these younger kids are on their phone all the time. They don't give a shit. Maybe kind of reboot it that way. I don't know. But I feel like, if they're redoing Halloween, they can certainly redo Friday the 13th.
Well, and what it needs is somebody. I didn't love the 2018 Halloween, but I will say that one of the things that I did admire about it is that Danny McBride and David Gordon Green took it seriously. They were clearly fans of it. They took it seriously, and they had the talent to do something interesting with it.
Was
What?
he in that? Danny McBride? Was he in the movie?
No, he wrote it. He
Okay.
wrote it with Gordon Green. He may have had a cameo. I can't remember, but he's not one of the
Okay.
major characters in it.
He would be a funny camp counselor at Crystal Lake.
Exactly. And what it needs is it needs somebody who isn't embarrassed to be making a Friday the 13th movie.
Right.
Because
Right.
other than a couple of the directors in the series, almost everybody seemed uniformly embarrassed to be making a Friday the 13th movie. And that's not going to help you be successful. What you really need is somebody who grew up on it, who's a fan, but who also has an idea that is different and can do something with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, kind of what do they always say about good comedy is you got to play it straight. And
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's, Halloween 2018, it plays it straight. It's a hardcore, straightforward movie.
Yeah.
I don't think it completely is successful, but I don't hate it for trying. I'll tell you that much, Colin. I do not hate that movie for trying. and I would love for somebody to try with Friday the 13th the same way they tried with Halloween 2018.
Yeah, I might need to check that out. Okay, well, my last question is why are we still talking about this series? Is it some kind of 80s nostalgia we have? Because you said they haven't made a new Friday the 13th movie in 10 years or so, and maybe it's over. I kind of doubt that. But even on the terms of us kind of talking, like, what, for lack of a better word, why do these movies still resonate, or why are we still talking about them? Is it because we grew up in the 80s, or is it for some other reason?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there's definitely a massive wave of 80s nostalgia. I mean, that big Scream Factory box set of all the Friday the 13th that just came out, that's not being bought by 16-year-olds. That's being bought by people like me who are 44-year-olds with the disposable income to spend $130 on a bunch of Blu-rays. So there's definitely some 80s nostalgia there, but there's a lot of things that have 80s nostalgia, and Friday somehow still manages to stick. And you're right. I said it might be over, but I don't know that it will be, because all you have to do is walk into a Spirit Halloween store and see how much Jason stuff there still is there. Like, Jason as a concept is such a part of culture now that even if the movies are forgotten, I think Jason is going to stay with us. And I think that's the reason why we keep talking about them. Like I said, I think they're a lot of fun. I think they're good gateway horror movies because they're not terribly scary. In spite of their reputation, they're not that violent, certainly compared to some of their contemporaries. They're not that sleazy or salacious. And so if you've got a 13-year-old that is starting to get interested in horror and you want to sort of ease them in before you get them into some more hard-edged horror that they might watch later, the Friday movies are kind of a good gateway drug. They're kind of a good gateway horror movie. And so I think that keeps them relevant as well, because they're just edgy enough so that you can, if you're a kid or that, you can feel like you're watching something you're not supposed to, but they're not I Spit on Your Grave or Last House on the Left, or, in a newer term, like the French New Wave movies, or the French New Extremity movies, like Martyrs. They're not something like that. They're almost, especially in 2020, kind of wholesome in a weird way. And so you couple that with this just absolutely staggeringly awesome, cool, iconic looking character. I have to say iconic looking because, again, Jason's kind of a cipher. He's a force of nature. He's hard to even call him a character. But this absolutely iconic looking character, and you've got a recipe for something that we're going to keep talking about for a while.
Yeah.
And I really think that's why. I think that what was super upsetting to people in 1982 has now become comforting to a lot of people in 2020. And that makes them feel like it's okay to show it to their kids or their teens. And that's going to always keep it going. If you can get that kind of thing, that's going to keep something around for a long time.
It's interesting because yeah, after a while, these things get commodified. And I don't know how old I was, but I walked into a store and there was like a Jason bobblehead, a Freddy bobblehead, or whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, any teeth that these series had, I think is been really dulled at this point. We've got like dolls of them, you can buy. So he's kind of been domesticated, I guess, Jason and Freddy too. But yeah, maybe he's just sort of like we're kind of watching these guys as kind of like the last of the great movie monsters, and nothing really since that has measured up. Can you think of anything quite like that now?
Before I answer that, it's too bad we don't have video, because I would show you my plush dancing Jason that is the cutest little son of a bitch you've ever seen in your life. And you're right, they've totally been commodified. They're toothless, and I think that's now why they last. It's the Friday the 13th is the Disney of horror at this point. And I mean that as a compliment. It's a safe way to introduce people to horror. To go back to your other question of the last of the great movie monsters, Ghostface from Scream is probably the last kind of, well, I would say one that I think is still very newer, but has become very iconic, at least amongst horror fans, is from, it's Sam, the spirit of Halloween, from a movie called Trick or Treat. Again, has a very iconic look. That's one of the things I think. I sound like a friggin' marketer here, but the reality is the horror icons that last are the ones that have the iconic looks. You think of Pinhead from Hellraiser, and you think of, Jason and Freddy, and Sam has a very iconic look. Pennywise from It has a very iconic look. I mean, he's probably the best one, but he's not new. But I do really like Bill Skarsgård's new, sort of interpretation of him.
Yeah.
Those
time of year to check all those things, because it's like you just go down the street and you see any number of these characters.
Yeah, like I said, you can really tell who's going to last. Walk into a Spirit Halloween store. I mean, that's going to tell you which of all of these things are going to last and why. Because I remember a few years, and this isn't horror related, but a few years ago when David Ayer's God Awful Suicide Squad came out, there was so many Joker, because that came out in August. So going right into that Halloween season, there was so much Joker stuff there. And now this year, there's not a single thing. There's still quite a bit of Harley Quinn stuff because she stays popular, but not a single Jared Leto Joker thing. But still always going to have your Freddy and your Jason and your Leatherface, and all of that stuff is always still going to stay very popular because it's iconic and it's part of our culture.
Yeah, for sure. And I wonder too if they hadn't come up with the hockey mask in that third movie, if he would have survived as a character, because that really kind of made it. I mean, the first two movies did what they did, but it was really the hockey mask that kind of solidified his his reputation in the horror world. It's kind of funny.
I would bet almost everything I own that if they had not come up with the hockey mask, he wouldn't have survived. The sackhead Jason has a cool look, but it's way reminiscent of another movie called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Right. And we don't really talk about The Town That Dreaded Sundown a whole lot unless you're a big horror nerd. Why? Because the sack over your head ain't that iconic. A hockey mask is. That's the biggest reason. The decision to do the hockey mask, I think it just can't be overstated how important that was to that franchise.
And was it, I know it's accidental in the movie. Do you know if it was accidental from the creator's point of view to have it in the movie?
Not really accidental. Little bit yes, little bit no. It was trying to find something new to do. And it's been a while since I've read. Again, the best way to answer that is to check out Crystal Lake Memories. But it was trying to find something different, something a little more iconic that would last. They didn't quite expect it to last the way it did. At least that's my memory of it.
All right. Well, Michael, I was glad I could talk to you before Halloween, and I hope I'll definitely get this up by next week. Just some time for Halloween. But I knew you were the man to talk about with this, so I'm glad you were able to spend some time with me. and just tell me, tell everybody what you got going on, where they can find you on social media.
Sure, you can find me personally at Hibachi Justice on Twitter and at Hibachi Justice on Letterboxd. You can find the work that I do with the Dana Buckler Show. The two best ways to find it are to follow us on Twitter at the Dana Buckler Show, and also you can check out our link tree, which is just linktree/Dana Buckler Show. You can also hear my other podcast, Adkins Undisputed, dedicated to the movies of Scott Adkins. You can follow that on Twitter at Adkins Podcast. Those are the best ways to get. I could bury everybody with a bunch of other links to find me, but if you find me in those places, you'll find me everywhere. I do also want to take a minute because he is the man that got me into podcasting. Dana has a new show on Dash Radio, which is an internet radio streaming app. You download it to your phone. It's called Hollywood Unfiltered. It airs every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's really terrific. It's him doing news and celebrity interviews a lot of directors and producers and people like that. I pop up on there. I'm the official, I guess, film reviewer for it. So I pop up every week reviewing whatever, as best we can in 2020, determine whatever the big movie of the week is going to be. So please check us out on that as well.
All right. Very cool. And thanks again, Michael. Great talking to you.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. Thanks for having me on.
Likewise. Take care.